It wasn't the isolation that truly unnerved me. Not at first. Isolation was my sanctuary, the reason I hiked 3 days deeper into the Bitterwood National Preserve than any sane person would ever venture. I was searching for silence, a pure, unadulterated absence of human noise, necessary for my work-tracking migratory patterns. But when I found the tree, the silence shattered, replaced by a deafening, internal shriek. The air had grown sharp, the kind of biting cold that precedes a heavy snow, turning the forest floor rigid under my boots. I was navigating through a dense cluster of mature white pines, their massive trunks blocking the low winter sun, plunging the area into perpetual twilight. And then there it was, not hidden, not subtle, but aggressively apparent in its complete, absolute wrongness, a Christmas tree. It was a perfectly shaped blue spruce, perhaps 20 feet tall, impossibly vibrant and green against the muted browns and greys of the surrounding forest. But it wasn't the species or the size that froze the blood in my veins. It was the fact that it was painstakingly, deliberately, and horrifyingly decorated. My rational mind, always the last bastion against the encroaching fear in the wilderness, scrambled for an explanation. A hunter's ritual? A lost family's marker? Some forgotten boundary marker decorated decades ago and preserved by the dry, cold air? But as I took the first hesitant step toward the circle of shadows guarding the base of the spruce, I saw the ornaments clearly, and my ability to rationalize evaporated like mist in the heat. They weren't ornaments. They were shoes. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of small shoes hanging from the thick, sturdy branches. They dangled by laces or strips of stiff twine, each one swaying imperceptibly in the total absence of wind, like the pendulums of countless silent clocks. I stopped dead, the fine hairs on my neck standing rigid. My backpack felt suddenly enormous and useless. My binoculars, usually an extension of my sight, were now dead weight. I thought immediately of hunters, perhaps some macabre joke played by a local eccentric, using discarded objects to mock the consumerism of the holiday they were attempting to avoid. But the shoes, the sheer uniformity of the size range. They were all children's shoes. Tiny sneakers, soft leather boots, patent Mary Janes scuffed at the toe, rubber flip-flops clinging improbably to the evergreen needles, all sizes associated with toddlers and small grade schoolers. The sight was less a display of holiday cheer and more an archaeological layer of grief. It was the physical manifestation of absence, a collection of objects that had outlived their owner's ability to wear them, yet were too specific, too personal, to simply be trash. I edged closer, my breath hitching in my throat, forming thick white clouds in the frigid air. The smell was the first thing that assaulted me once I broke the threshold of the surrounding pine stand. Deep, heavy pine resin, mixed with something else, something subtly chemical, like old, cured leather that had been recently handled, perhaps even polished. The tree was meticulously arranged. The smaller, infant-sized booties, pink, blue, yellow knit, were positioned on the lowest branches, easily within reach. As the eye traveled upward, the shoes grew proportionally larger, culminating in high-top basketball sneakers near the midsection, then tapering off again towards the top, with smaller, perhaps more symbolic, items. My initial calculation, performed through a haze of shock, was grossly underestimated. I wasn't looking at dozens of shoes, I was looking at hundreds. Every branch bore the weight of multiple pairs, sometimes single shoes, occasionally just a tightly knotted sock stuffed into the cavity of a discarded loafer. I forced myself to touch the nearest ornament, a miniature red Converse, size 3. The fabric faded, but the white rubber toe cap remarkably clean. It felt heavy, weighed down not by moisture, but by the earth that clung subtly to the grooves of the sole. When I lifted it carefully, examining the fraying laces, I saw that the underside of the shoe had been scraped clean of debris, leaving only the dried, dark memory of mud in the crevices. Why clean them? Why display them with such disturbing fastidiousness? I let go of the sneaker, and it swung back against the thick pine branch with a soft, unsettling thud. It made no sound of plastic or dry wood hitting. It sounded like meat hitting pine. The chilling, inescapable problem was this. If this was a prank, It was one of monumental effort, requiring coordination, time, and a dedication to the morbid, far-exceeding simple mischief. We were miles from the nearest logging road, and the trail I had followed, barely a deer path, was utterly untrodden. There were no fresh boot prints, no discarded wrappers, no sign of recent human activity beyond the creation of the tree itself. The only footprints visible were my own, sinking into the layer of fresh, dusting snow. The open loops began to twist in my stomach like barbed wire. Where did these shoes come from? Why this specific tree? Why weren't they scattered, lost, discarded? Why were they centralized, displayed like trophies, or perhaps like offerings? And the most paralyzing question, if the shoes were here, where were the children who wore them? I moved slowly around the perimeter, my camera forgotten, my tracking equipment irrelevant. My focus had become clinical, a defense mechanism against the rising tide of pure panic. I needed data. I needed to catalog the horror. I started counting. One branch, low slung, yielded 11 pairs in total, 22 individual shoes. There was a tiny rubber rain boot, yellow and bright, contrasting violently with the somber green. Next to it, a pair of worn-out slippers, their soles thin and ripped. I noticed a pattern interrupt. Many of the shoes were laced or tied shut, as if prepared for transport or storage, while others were wide open, gaping dark invitations. I reached for a dusty white ballet slipper hanging near the trunk. Its satin was brittle, cracked in places. Inside, pressed against the inner arch, I could just make out faint discoloration. Not dirt, but something darker, almost rust-colored. I quickly retracted my hand. This wasn't merely a collection of junk, these were artifacts bearing the painful, undeniable history of use. The sheer volume was staggering. I estimated that if the density I was seeing on the lower branches extended up the 20 feet of the tree, I was easily looking at 500 individual shoes, a number so absurdly high it pointed toward mass collection, not a simple found object installation. This wasn't a small family's loss. This represented an entire community's disappeared youth, or perhaps a collector whose range was geographically vast and deeply disturbing. I climbed slightly onto a low-hanging branch to examine a cluster of high-top sneakers. They were bulkier, teenage sizes, indicating the age range extended beyond infants and small children. One shoe, a grey canvas sneaker, was particularly clean. I unhooked it, running my finger along the inside rim. That's when I saw it. Tucked tightly beneath the tongue, preserved by the surrounding leather and the perpetual cold, was a small, plasticized tag. A name tag, the kind parents iron into clothing or loop through backpack zippers before the first day of school. I peeled it free with shaking fingers. The plastic was warped, the edges softened by time and moisture, but the ink was miraculously clear. Written in the wavering, hesitant script of an early elementary student was a single devastating name, Lily. The world tilted again, harder this time. The clinical detachment I had built around myself crumbled. This wasn't conceptual art. This wasn't history. This was a direct, personalized punch to the gut. Lily was real. Lily wore this shoe. Lily's parents prepared this tag. And Lily, or whatever happened to her, contributed to this horrifying, silent monument in the middle of nowhere. The chilling thought surfaced, raw and undeniable. Perhaps Lily wasn't the donor of the shoe, but the first victim commemorated here. I felt a profound, overwhelming nausea. I leaned my head against the prickly pine bark, trying to regulate my breathing. The silence outside the tree was immense, a vacuum that felt pressurized and ready to burst. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to turn, run, forget, and report this impossible sick discovery to the nearest park ranger, who was, by my estimation, a grueling 2-day hike away. But I couldn't move. Lily's name was a tether, anchoring me to the monstrosity. I lifted my gaze slowly, following the spine of the tree upwards, past the heavy clusters of sneakers and boots. The trunk thickened, becoming gnarled and ancient-looking as it ascended toward the canopy. The number of ornaments diminished in the upper reaches, but their impact grew heavier. Near the very top, where a traditional star or angel would crown the festive structure, there was something else. It was larger than any other ornament, heavier, dominating the apex of the horrific sculpture. It wasn't a child's shoe. It was a heavy, dark, adult work boot. It hung precisely centered, high above the hundreds of children's remnants, suspended not by twine, but by a length of thick, rusted chain wrapped several times around the main branch. The leather was scarred, the sole thick with hardened mud and oil. It was the shoe of a laborer, a strong man, a presence. It hung there like a crown, a sentinel, or perhaps a signature. My blood turned to ice water. The work boot wasn't a warning. It was a boast. I lowered my eyes from the sentinel boot, back down to the frozen earth surrounding the base of the spruce. The pine needles here were thick, brown, and undisturbed for decades, matted down into a dense carpet of decay, except for one section. Right at the base of the trunk, where the massive root flared out and gripped the soil, the earth looked wrong. It wasn't frozen solid like the rest of the ground. It was churned, slightly mounded, and covered thinly with a recent haphazard scattering of fresh pine needles. The frost hadn't fully taken hold here. Someone had recently dug. A tremor ran through me, starting in my knees and locking my jaw shut. I had initially assumed this was a ritual site, perhaps decades old, a cold case laid bare. But the disturbed earth and the relatively clean state of some of the lower shoes suggested activity. Perhaps ongoing maintenance, perhaps something far worse and more immediate. The tree was not a memorial. It was an active inventory. I looked frantically back towards the path I had taken, straining my eyes through the thickening shadows. The forest was utterly silent again, a silence that now felt profoundly hostile, as if the bitter wood itself was holding its breath, waiting for my next move. I fumbled for the satellite radio clipped to my shoulder strap, my fingers numb with cold and panic. I had to report this, give my coordinates, and pray the signal could punch through the dense canopy. I flipped the power switch. Nothing. I tried again, adjusting the antenna, trying to find a clear patch of sky. Static. Just the dry, hissing sound of nothingness, swallowed by the dense growth of the pines. I was alone. Utterly, irrevocably alone, miles from help, standing before a monument built from the remnants of lost children. I felt the sudden, desperate urgency of time. Whatever created this abomination could not be far, or perhaps was even watching, patiently waiting for me to leave. But I couldn't leave. Lily's name was burned into my mind. I couldn't abandon this scene without knowing what lay beneath the frozen, recently disturbed earth. My role as an observer had ended. I was now a reluctant, terrified participant. The weak winter sun was sinking rapidly behind the western ridges. The twilight would soon surrender to the deep, moonless night. I had hours, maybe less, before whatever built this returned to its work. I had to move, but not away. I grabbed the small entrenching shovel from the side of my pack. My mission had changed entirely. I had to catalogue them all, every single forgotten pair, every name, every size. But first I had to find out what was hidden beneath the roots of the world's most sinister Christmas tree. I had to start digging now, right here, before the darkness swallowed the bitter wood and whatever awful truth it held. The shoes were the foundation of the mystery, but the disturbed earth promised the climax. The next step was down. We have to go down. We have to see what they buried. The air, which moments before had felt crisp and clean with the smell of wet pine needles, now tasted like metallic fear. I was hyperventilating, but I dared not make a sound louder than the ragged wheeze pulling in and out of my chest. My mind was screaming for me to sprint, to turn and run until the sight of the tree, the obscene harvest of tiny lost lives hanging from its branches, was nothing more than a grotesque hallucination banished by distance. But the forest floor held me captive, the soft earth seeming to mold itself around the soles of my boots, anchoring me to the spectacle. I was caught in the unforgiving, blinding scrutiny of the undeniable reality. This was not natural, it was deliberate, and it was horrifyingly personal. I forced my eyes to track the perimeter again, a desperate attempt to find the edges of the nightmare. The shoes, illuminated by the struggling late-afternoon sunlight that filtered down through the dense canopy, were the only things that seemed to possess color in this otherwise muted, moss-green world. Red sneakers, blue rain boots, white leather sandals, tiny brown brogues. Each item was a miniature mausoleum, a testament to a life abruptly truncated. They weren't just tossed or scattered, they were meticulously placed. Thin, almost invisible twine, the kind used for delicate gift wrapping or perhaps specialized fishing line, held each shoe aloft. Some were knotted tightly around the laces, others pierced slightly through the leather near the heel. The person who had done this possessed patience, precision, and an almost artistic dedication to the macabre. This wasn't a crime of sudden madness. It was a ritual of chilling premeditation. I took one shuddering step closer, bending low, fighting the instinct to vomit. My gaze fixed on a particular pair of shoes near the base of the trunk, suspended just high enough to clear the encroaching ferns. They were patent leather Mary Janes, glossy black, perhaps size 7 toddler. The toes were scuffed deeply, indicating repeated vigorous dragging or frustrated kicking on asphalt. But it wasn't the wear that froze my blood. It was the interior. Inside the right shoe, tucked neatly against the heel, was a crumpled piece of red ribbon, the kind you might tie into a girl's pigtail. It was the only item that wasn't footwear, the only personal relic included, and its presence felt like a shouted confession. It suggested not just theft or disposal, but a specific cold knowledge of the victim. The air around the tree was silent, unnaturally so. The usual chorus of the woods, the chatter of jays, the busy rustle of foraging animals, was absent. It felt as if the surrounding woods were holding their breath, waiting for me to react, or perhaps waiting for the return of the perpetrator. I scanned the darkness between the surrounding spruces, seeing only shadows that elongated and shifted with my peripheral vision. Every shadow became a lurking figure. Every snapping twig under my own weight sounded like the heavy boot of someone approaching from behind. The terror was escalating from vague dread to a sharp, physical pain in my chest. I had to know who these belonged to, and I needed to know now before the light failed completely, and I was left alone with the shadows and the morbid decorations. My hand reached out, trembling violently, toward a small bright blue neoprene sneaker hanging at eye level. It was clearly newer, perhaps only worn a handful of times, judging by the pristine white sole. It was one of those lightweight athletic shoes designed for flexibility, the kind a parent buys believing they are investing in healthy foot development for an energetic boy. I carefully unhooked the twine, the friction against the rough bark whispering in the silence. The shoe was feather-light, almost weightless, an impossible burden of sorrow. I turned it over in my hands, noting the Velcro strap which was still cinched, as if just removed from a foot. The smell hit me then, not the rot I had feared, nor the heavy odor of death, but something worse, something more insidious. Fabric softener and stale sweat, the persistent, innocent scent of childhood. This wasn't old evidence, this was recent. The owners of these shoes were not long gone. Turning the shoe completely upside down, I inspected the inside flap of the tongue. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. Sometimes parents write initials, or a classroom number, or a full name. I held the neoprene closer to my face, squinting in the dimming light. And there it was, scrawled in neat, almost artistic black permanent marker, slightly bled into the synthetic fabric. Leo. Just Leo. The simplicity of it was crushing. Not LS, not Leo Smith, just Leo. A singular, heartbreaking identification mark on an object that should have been kicked off carelessly onto a bedroom floor, not displayed on a monument of dread deep within the woods. I dropped the blue shoe back onto the twine, not wanting to disturb the terrible symmetry of the display any further, and instinctively backed away, my eyes wide and searching. Who was Leo? I had to pull myself together and think rationally. I was near a town, but the town wasn't large. Missing persons cases, especially those involving children, became local news instantly. I tried to recall the faces on the missing posters I had half noticed taped to lampposts near the trailhead parking lot weeks ago, or maybe months ago. The memory was a frustrating blur of pixelated images and outdated flyers curled at the edges. Had there been a Leo? The realization that I was standing in what amounted to a trophy room, potentially connected to a string of local disappearances, propelled me into action, but not toward escape. I couldn't just leave this. If I ran, if I went straight to the authorities without proof, I'd risk them dismissing me as hysterical. or worse, disturbing the scene before forensic teams could process it. This forest was remote. Getting a police presence here would take time, perhaps hours. I needed more than just a name. I needed context. I forced myself to crouch lower, scanning the base of the pine. The ground under the canopy was mostly covered in a thick layer of needles and moss, undisturbed except for the area immediately surrounding the trunk where the shoes were highest. But under the lowest branches, tucked into the thick protective layer of decaying duff, I noticed a slight disruption, a patch where the needles looked freshly overturned. It was small, no bigger than the palm of my hand, but it was a pattern interrupt in the otherwise uniform forest floor. I hesitated, fear churning acid in my stomach. What if it was a trap? What if I reached out and something seized my wrist? The light was failing fast. I knew I wouldn't have the courage to return here in the pitch black. It was now or never. I extended my hand, brushing aside the loose needles with the tips of my fingers. Beneath them, the earth was dark and rich. My fingers bumped against something solid, smooth and slightly cold. I quickly pulled it out, trying to minimize the disturbance to the surrounding area. It was a small, crudely whittled wooden bird. Not a professional carving, but something made by amateur hands, maybe a child's art project or perhaps a parent whittling away time. The wood was soft pine, unfinished, and its shape was simple, a rounded body, a rudimentary head, and a single, slightly jagged wing. One side of the bird was painted a bright, almost childish yellow. It felt alien and out of place, utterly disconnected from the pristine, almost clinical display of the shoes above. This small object was a beacon of messy, imperfect humanity in a setting of perfect, horrifying order. I turned the bird over and over, trying to find significance. Was it a signature, a marker left by the perpetrator, or had it fallen from the pocket of one of the children whose shoes adorned the tree? If the latter, it meant that the children had been here, alive, near this very spot. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the woods. It wasn't a twig under my boot. It was distinct, heavy, and sounded like a larger branch snapping, perhaps under the weight of something substantial. Not far off to my right, maybe 50 yards into the densest part of the spruce thicket. My entire body locked up. I dropped the wooden bird back into the duff and froze, every muscle coiled, heart drumming a warning siren in my ears. The sound was too loud for a deer, too irregular for a naturally falling limb. It sounded like an intentional movement. I held my breath listening, straining to hear beyond the pounding in my own head. Silence descended again, thick and heavy, but now it was charged with immediate, palpable threat. The woods were no longer holding their breath, they were actively watching. I slowly, agonizingly retreated backward on my haunches, keeping the tree in my sight, desperate to maintain visual confirmation of the only landmark that mattered. I needed to get distance, but I couldn't simply turn my back and flee. Not yet. My eyes swept back up to the branches. If I was going to call the police, I needed more than Leo. I needed a clearer identity. The Mary Janes near the base, the ones with the red ribbon. They were older, potentially a more established case. Fighting the paralyzing adrenaline surge, I crept back toward the base of the trunk. The smell of pine and old leather was overwhelming now. I knelt quickly, reaching again for the Mary Jane. This time, I needed to examine the stitching, the interior branding, anything that might link this shoe to a specific manufacturer, time frame, or location. I carefully lifted the stiff leather, peeling back the tongue. The leather lining was worn smooth where the heel had rested, but near the arch I saw a faded, almost illegible stamp. It wasn't a brand name. It looked like a date, or perhaps a hospital wristband number transferred in ink. I pressed my thumb against the lining, trying to clear away the microscopic debris. My flashlight, which I still hadn't fully deployed for fear of giving away my position, was clutched in my left hand. I flicked it on for a single, momentary burst of light, directing the narrow beam intensely onto the stamped area. The light flared, blindingly brief, illuminating not a number, but 3 letters stamped deep into the leather of the insole, followed by a crude, scratched drawing. The letters were SAF, but the drawing was unmistakable. It was a poorly rendered silhouette of a small, 3-petal flower, the kind only a certain age group of girls learns to draw in grade school, followed by a single dark teardrop shape beneath it. I immediately recognized the pattern. It matched a flyer I had finally registered earlier in the week, stapled to the community notice board outside the town hall. Not just a missing child, but a recently missing child. Sarah Ann Finch, known to draw that specific awkward flower everywhere. Her parents had mentioned it in the pleas for information. The shoe was identical to the description on the flyer. Black patent leather, size 7. My breath hitched, catching in my throat. This was no general collection of discarded items. This was Sarah Ann Finch's shoe, hanging here, fresh evidence of a monstrous act. And Leo's shoe was here too. The tree was a chronological marker of the disappearances, a growing ledger of the town's most terrifying secrets. The realization shattered my precarious composure. The calculated horror of the display, the proximity of the culprit implied by the snap I heard, the identity of the shoes, it all converged into a single overwhelming certainty. I was witnessing something profoundly evil, and I was not alone. The silence that followed the snap had been broken only by the frantic beat of my own blood, but now it was broken again. This time it wasn't a snap. It was a faint, low sound, like gravel shifting under weight, followed by a slight, almost imperceptible rustle of dry leaves, coming from the shadows immediately behind the tree trunk, just out of my visual range. It wasn't 50 yards away anymore. It was 10 feet. My investigation was over. Survival instantly eclipsed the need for proof. I dropped the Mary Jane shoe, letting it swing gently on its twine mooring, and scrambled backward, rising to a crouch, pivoting not to run towards the road, but away from the immediate threat, deeper into the side thicket, relying on the cover of the dense foliage to conceal my presence. I had seen too much. The information was enough. The forest had suddenly become hostile, transforming from a serene backdrop into a hunting ground. And I was the prey. I had to get out and I had to get help. But first I needed to disappear without alerting whatever or whoever was standing just beyond that gruesome Christmas tree. The chilling fact of Leo and Sarah Ann Finch was now tucked away, a burning coal in my memory, and the only thing that mattered was making the next breath, the next step, silent and unseen. The game had changed from investigation to evasion, and the darkness was rushing in to equalize the playing field, making every shadow a potential hiding place, and every shadow a potential threat. The cold was no longer just physical. It had burrowed into the marrow, a paralyzing existential dread that seemed to radiate from the towering, fetid monument before me. I tried to move, to turn away, to retreat to the safety of the known path, but my feet were anchored by some terrible gravity, pulling me perpetually inward toward the central trunk. The air was thick, suffocatingly still, and tasted faintly of old leather and damp earth, a scent now inextricably linked to this vision of inverted joy and profound malice. I had estimated 30, perhaps 40 ornaments initially, relying on a panicked peripheral count. Now forcing myself to look with clinical precision, a desperate attempt to replace terror with calculation, I realized the count was laughably low. As the moonlight, fractured and weak, shifted slightly through the sparse canopy, it illuminated deeper clusters within the branches. Shoes hung back to back, overlapping, forming dense, weeping bundles. I counted the immediately visible rows again, moving systematically, struggling to keep the numbers straight in my frozen mind. 48, 52, 61. And those were just the ones I could easily discern on the lower half of the tree. Higher up, where the boughs thinned and twisted toward the invisible sky, I could see dozens more, black silhouettes against the pale gloom, perhaps reaching 80, maybe even 100. 100 tiny vessels of memory, of movement, of childhood abandoned. The sheer volume suggested a timeline stretching far beyond a single incident or a brief, isolated catastrophe. This was a long-term project, a seasonal or perhaps annual pilgrimage by some unseen architect of despair. I felt sickened by the implication, the consistency, the dedication required to maintain and add to this atrocious display over years, perhaps decades. The ornaments were not randomly tossed or casually discarded. They were meticulously placed. Each shoe, whether a brittle Mary Jane, a scuffed running sneaker, or a small hardened leather boot, was suspended by a specific type of binding, coarse, thick hemp twine, almost black with age and moisture, tied in a heavy, deliberate knot around the ankle strap or the remaining laces. The twine itself looked like the kind used for old farm work or heavy maritime knots, strong, durable, and resistant to the elements. This detail amplified the horror. It wasn't the spontaneous work of a madman passing through. It was planned, structural, intended to last. I took a single, shuddering step closer, compelled to examine the attachment point on one particular shoe, a small, bright red rubber boot, seemingly the newest of the collection, though still faded and crusty with mud. The twine was not just tied around the boot, it was looped through a heavy, rusted metal eyelet that had been hammered directly into the bark of the spruce branch, just deep enough to hold firm. Whoever did this had come prepared, equipped not just with the victim's belongings, but with tools, with a gruesome sense of permanence. This was a shrine, a warning, or perhaps a ledger, a record kept meticulously in the depths of the anonymous woods. My investigative focus, born purely of a need to categorize the incomprehensible, shifted to the base of the tree. The roots were massive, gnarled like the knuckles of an ancient giant, rising up from the carpet of pine needles and moss. The ground directly beneath the tree felt oddly flattened, almost packed down, as if frequently visited or perhaps even swept. There was a conspicuous lack of fallen debris or undergrowth immediately around the trunk. And then I saw the outline, mostly covered by a stubborn layer of green moss and wet needles, but undeniable once my eyes adjusted to the precise texture of the forest floor. It was a shallow depression, perhaps 3 feet wide and 4 feet long, located just off the main root system. It wasn't a fresh grave or even a recent disturbance, but something older, settled. I dropped to my knees, heedless of the freezing dampness that instantly soaked through my jeans. I swept away the loose detritus, my breath catching in my throat as the structure beneath became clearer. Embedded in the earth, barely visible, were 3 small, irregular stones, flat and worn smooth by time, arranged in a rough triangle pointing toward the trunk. They looked like grave markers or perhaps boundaries, placed decades ago and then forgotten, only to be rediscovered by my morbid curiosity. I ran a trembling finger over the central stone. It was icy cold, heavier than it looked, and beneath the clinging moss I could just make out faint, almost invisible etchings. Not letters, not names, but symbols, simple, stylized spirals, and what looked like crude depictions of stars, or perhaps snowflakes. I stood up instantly, the blood draining from my face. This wasn't just a site of disposal or morbid decoration. This was ritualistic. The atmosphere shifted from horrifying crime scene to something far older, something tied to the earth, to the deep, silent secrets of the forest itself. The silence that had initially felt like an absence of sound now felt like a heavy cloak, designed to smother any noise I might make. I listened intensely, straining my ears past the ringing pulse in my own head. Nothing. Too quiet. The woods are never this quiet, even in the deepest winter stillness. There should be the drip of melting ice, the rustle of a small animal, the inevitable creak of the ancient trees settling, but there was only the sound of my own shallow, panicked breathing and the frantic thump of my heart trying to escape my ribs. This lack of natural sound was a warning, a pattern interrupt far more terrifying than any sudden noise could have been. It suggested that everything nearby was either holding its breath or had been intentionally cleared out. I forced myself to circle the tree entirely, trying to expand the perimeter of my investigation, constantly glancing over my shoulder, convinced I would see eyes reflecting back from the shadows. The area behind the spruce was even darker, sheltered from the minimal moonlight by a cluster of denser pines. It was here, tucked deep into a crevice between 2 large boulders, that I found the second, more disturbing piece of evidence. It was not a shoe, nor was it ritualistic. It was purely practical, purely human, and devastatingly contemporary. A rusted, half-crushed thermos bottle, the kind you might carry coffee or hot chocolate in for a long, cold day outdoors. It had clearly been there for some time, perhaps a season or 2, but it was not ancient. Lying next to it, partially dissolved by moisture, was a heavy-duty commercial plastic zip tie, the type used by contractors or utility workers, long, thick, and surprisingly strong. Why a zip tie? Why near the site of the hemp twine bindings? I realized with sickening clarity that the older shoes, the ones higher up the tree, likely predated the widespread use of commercial plastic zip ties, relying purely on rope and hooks. But the newer additions, perhaps the bright red boot I had just examined, might have involved modern tools for quicker installation or added security. The perpetrator hadn't just continued the tradition, they had updated the methodology. They were still here, or had been recently. This realization that the monster behind this display was not a ghost of the past, but an active presence, triggered a wave of ice-cold adrenaline that finally broke through my paralysis. I needed to move. I needed to document this and escape before the silence broke, before the air stopped merely feeling like I was being watched and became the confirmed reality of it. I pulled out my phone, the screen blindingly bright in the gloom. The signal, predictably, was non-existent. I should have expected it. I was deep enough now that I was completely cut off. The phone was reduced to a camera, a poor substitute for a lifeline. My hands shook so violently that it took 3 attempts to stabilize the shot enough to capture the overall image of the tree. The flash, a blinding burst of white light, was immediately terrifying. It illuminated the scene starkly, revealing every macabre detail of the suspension, every knot, every tattered fragment of fabric, and then plunged the world back into a deeper, more profound darkness. The noise of the shutter, minuscule in a normal setting, sounded like a gunshot in the sepulchral stillness. I took close-ups of the red boot, of the specific twine, of the triangular stones, of the rusted thermos. With each flash I felt more exposed, convinced that the bright burst of light was acting like a beacon, drawing attention directly to my location. I worked quickly, desperately, knowing that the time spent staring at a tiny screen was time not spent scanning the perimeter. As I leaned in to capture the detail of the etched stones again, my flashlight beam traced a line up the massive, shaggy trunk of the spruce. About 7 feet up, just above where the lower branches began and partially obscured by a thick curtain of moss and clinging lichen, was another mark. It was carved deep into the wood, older than the etchings on the stones, suggesting decades of slow growth had partially absorbed the wound. I instinctively reached up, scraping away the obscuring greenery. The carvings weren't symbols this time, but heavy, deliberate letters. 3 of them, stacked vertically, crudely rendered but distinct. M. J.K. The initials were huge, etched with something sharp and heavy, perhaps an axe or a large knife. They weren't meant to be hidden, only to be kept secret by time and the encroaching forest. Were they the initials of the artist, the originator of this perverse tradition? Or perhaps horrifyingly the first victim, memorialized in a chilling, proprietary manner? The placement was key. These initials were not carved carelessly at chest level like typical teenage graffiti. They were high, commanding, positioned almost like a sentinel guarding the grotesque harvest below. I retreated 3 steps, stumbling backward over a hidden root, the sudden sound echoing loudly. My head snapped up, scanning the dark lines of the pines. My heart slammed against my ribs, convinced I had heard a reciprocal sound, a slight shuffle, maybe 20 yards deep into the shadows to the west. I froze, absolutely still, relying purely on my hearing now. I held my breath until my lungs burned. There it was again. Not a footstep, not a snap of wood, but something softer, more elusive, a gentle, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. It sounded muffled, consistent, almost mechanical, like something lightly swaying in a draft that didn't exist, or perhaps a small, heavy object being gently struck against wood, deep in the absolute blackness. My adrenaline spiked, burning away the cold. All thoughts of analysis, of documentation vanished, replaced by the primal command, flee. I instinctively pivoted, intending to sprint back the way I came, but paused, held immobile by the unsettling sound and the terrible knowledge I possessed. If I ran, I might run directly into the source of the tapping. If I left now, I left the evidence unguarded, the terrible secret intact. And the thought of that silence, that horrific, sustained tradition, continuing because I was too much of a coward to expose it, was momentarily more paralyzing than the fear of death itself. I shifted my grip on the heavy flashlight, using it now not as an instrument of illumination, but as a potential weapon. I realized I had to check that sound. I couldn't leave this place without confirming if I was alone or if the collector had returned to inspect his grim gallery. The rhythmic tapping continued, maddeningly slow, maddeningly close. It was a dreadful lullaby emanating from the black throat of the ancient woods, beckoning me deeper into the inescapable darkness. My mind raced, constructing scenarios. If the source of the tapping was human, they knew I was here. The repeated camera flashes and my loud stumble would have guaranteed it. If they knew why the tapping, was it a signal, a distraction, a warning? I took a shaky step toward the west, toward the source of the sound, sacrificing retreat for the need to understand, to verify the threat. I moved slowly, silently, pushing through the thick undergrowth, the frozen ground crunching beneath my boots, fighting the absolute certainty that I was walking directly into a trap set years, maybe decades ago. The trees closed in around me, the pines becoming dense and tangled, and the rhythmic tap, tap, tap grew subtly, inexorably louder. The only thing I could be sure of was that I was no longer alone in this silent, suffocating pocket of the world, and whoever or whatever was making that sound had been waiting for the silence to break, waiting for a visitor. The frost had sharpened the air into tiny, agonizing needles that pricked every inch of exposed skin, yet the cold I felt was nothing compared to the seismic tremor that had seized my core. I was suspended in a horrifying tableau, my gaze locked on the small wooden carving at the base of the accursed pine. It wasn't the crude, weathered statue of some forgotten deity I had initially braced myself for. No, it was a precise, meticulous miniature of the tree itself, complete with tiny, carved replicas of the dozens upon dozens of shoes. But this model had one horrifying detail the real tree lacked: a small, recessed compartment sealed with sap. My fingers, thick and clumsy with fear and cold, fumbled with the hardened resin. The silence of the forest, once a comforting blanket of wilderness, had become a suffocating, echoing void, demanding that I hurry, that I move, that I scream. But panic was a lead weight in my lungs. When the compartment finally gave way with a sickening wet sound, a single object rolled out onto the frozen earth. A dried, yellowed slip of paper, folded precisely into a square. Unfurling it required the surgical precision of a bomb technician. My hands were shaking so violently that the edges threatened to tear. The paper was brittle, ancient, yet the ink was startlingly dark, preserved perhaps by the tree's own dark purpose. It wasn't a confession, nor was it a warning. It was a registry, a ledger. It listed dates, names, shortened nicknames mostly, and a single chilling annotation next to each entry, measured and filed. The dates spanned from the late 1930s all the way up to just 4 years ago. This wasn't a historical aberration. This was a continuous, active practice. My breath hitched, a ragged sound that sounded deafening in the stillness. I recognized a name that had been whispered in local folklore, a missing girl from the adjacent town whose case had gone cold 30 years prior. Her entry was meticulous. Below the last name, however, written in a different, fresher ink, an ink that looked still wet, still glossy, was a single line, italicized and waiting. The witness is observed. The paper slipped from my grasp. It wasn't the realization of murder that broke me. It was the realization of proximity. I wasn't just a discoverer. I was now part of the inventory. My presence had been noted. My observation had been logged. I didn't need to turn around to know. The air pressure shifted subtly, imperceptibly, but enough to register in the deeply primitive, panicked core of my brain. It was the scent that hit me first. A cloying, musky blend of damp, rich soil, stale human sweat, and something acrid, like old iron or dried blood. The sound that followed was nothing so dramatic as a footstep or a snapped twig. It was the soft, persistent shush of rough fabric dragging across the pine needles. I remained frozen, my back to the presence, calculating the distance to my vehicle, calculating the odds of a silent, sudden sprint. The silence stretched until it was taut, vibrating with the unspoken threat of violence. They look better on the tree, don't you think? The voice, when it came, was not a monstrous growl or a triumphant shriek. It was low, dry, and oddly conversational, like a meticulous librarian making an observation about shelf organization. It keeps them safe from the mice and the elements. A proper memorial requires preservation. My muscles locked, refusing the command to flee. I finally turned, rotating slowly, painfully, my eyes traveling up from the hem of the thick, dark woolen coat to the face of the figure standing perhaps 10 feet behind me. He was tall, gaunt, wrapped in layers of utilitarian, earth-toned clothing that made him almost invisible against the backdrop of the winter woods. He carried nothing, no weapon visible, but his hands were large, disproportionately so, resting casually at his sides. His face was the real terror. It was old, deeply lined, not with the pleasant patina of age, but with the severe etchings of relentless routine and chilling obsession. His eyes were pale, washed-out blue, fixed on me with an expression of detached, clinical curiosity. He looked less like a monster, and more like a man who had been alone in the woods for far too long, tending to a very strange garden. "You should not have touched the ledger," he said, shaking his head slightly, a movement of profound disappointment. "It's disrespectful to the process. The process requires reverence." "The shoes," I managed, the word a dry squeak, clinging to the back of my throat. "Where are the children?" A faint, almost sad smile touched the edges of his thin lips. "They are everywhere and nowhere. They are returned to the wood. The shoes," he gestured widely toward the tree with one of those massive, unsettling hands, "the shoes are the evidence of their journey. The shoes are the history. Think of it as a calendar tracking the years." He took a slow, deliberate step forward, and I instinctively took a step back, the crunch of the frozen ground echoing the finality of the confrontation. The watcher, the collector, the weaver, whatever this silent warden of lost souls was, paused, analyzing my fear with unnerving professionalism. "You recognized the name, didn't you? Elizabeth Tinsley. Such a small shoe she wore, such promise." He spoke of the victims not with malice, but with a horrifying proprietary care. "I knew she would be found eventually, not the way the police wanted, of course, but by someone who understood the importance of documentation." My mind raced, desperately searching for an angle, a distraction. I noted a heavy, gnarled root protruding from the ground near his right foot. It was my only chance. I had to break the conversational spell, shatter the quietude of the ritual. "This is not documentation," I spat out, my voice regaining a shaky strength fueled by pure survival adrenaline. "This is a trophy room for a monster." The watcher's expression didn't change, but his pale eyes narrowed ever so slightly. That word, monster, seemed to land on him with the sting of an unexpected insult, disturbing his careful, self-justifying narrative. "I offer them release," he corrected, his voice hardening, the librarian facade cracking to reveal a core of steel. "The world is chaotic, loud. I provide silence, I offer closure, and I document their departure for those who remain." He took another step, closing the gap to just 8 feet. "Now, you have seen the documentation. The rules are quite clear on this." "The rules," I scoffed, but internally I was calculating. If I ran now, I could get 30 feet before he tackled me. He was older, but he had the wiry strength of a predator who never missed a meal. "The rules of the silence," he replied, his gaze dropping momentarily to the shoes on the nearest branch, an act of reverence, a moment of vulnerability I instantly seized upon. Those who witness the documentation become part of the documentation. It's the final loop of the cycle. I had hoped you might understand this. This was the climax. This was the moment where the narrative snapped from silent suspense into raw, brutal action. I didn't wait for him to finish his philosophical justification. With a primal scream that tore the silence apart, a sound more animal than human, I launched myself forward, not toward my car, but directly toward him. It was a desperate bluff, a pattern interrupt. I feigned a move to tackle him, but at the last second I dropped low, throwing my shoulder directly into the protruding root I had spotted earlier, kicking a massive cloud of frozen dirt and pine needles directly into his face. The watcher gasped, startled by the sheer vulgarity and suddenness of the move. He staggered backward, his large hands flying up to shield his eyes, momentarily blinded by the debris. That was the window. I didn't run away, I ran through the center of the confrontation. As I cleared his stumbling form, I turned, grabbing the nearest heavy stone-sized lump of frozen soil and rock, and swung it wildly, connecting with sickening force against the nearest ornament, the trunk of the Christmas tree itself. The watcher roared, a sound of absolute incandescent rage and anguish. It was not the rage of a threatened killer, but the agony of a high priest watching his sacred altar desecrated. "No, the documentation! You destroy the history!" he shrieked, instantly forgetting me and lunging toward the tree, checking the damaged bark as if it were a mortal wound. I didn't stop to watch the extent of the damage. The distraction was fleeting, a few seconds at best, but it was enough. I ran. I didn't feel the burning in my lungs, the freezing ache in my extremities, or the sharp pull of the brush snagging my clothes. I ran on instinct. A terrified machine fueled by the image of my name being logged in that sterile, chilling ledger. I flew through the dense undergrowth, breaking branches that sounded like rifle shots in the crisp air. Behind me, the watcher's enraged screams faded and then returned, closer this time. He was fast, terrifyingly efficient in his domain. He knew the paths, the hidden routes, the clearings. I did not. My lungs were fire. My vision was tunneling. I needed a final burst, a definitive break. I remembered the direction of the old fire access road, the one covered in dense brush, which would eventually lead to the main path where my car was parked. I burst through a thicket of tangled rhododendrons and stumbled onto the access road. I risked a glance back. He was right there, emerging from the trees, silhouetted against the weak moonlight, his coat blending seamlessly with the night. He wasn't running so much as gliding, his movements economical and terrifyingly silent now that the initial rage had subsided. He was hunting. I pushed myself harder, the terrain rough and uneven. My foot snagged on something submerged, and I went down hard, skidding across the frozen gravel, the impact forcing the air from my chest in a painful whoosh. I tasted blood. I scrambled up, not even registering the pain in my twisted ankle, and saw the headlights of my old truck shimmering faintly through the final curtain of trees. Salvation. He was 50 yards behind me now, closing. I didn't bother reaching for the keys. The truck was always kept running in the winter. I vaulted into the driver's seat, slamming the door just as I saw his shadowy form burst into the clearing. I threw the transmission into drive, my foot slamming the accelerator to the floor. The tires spun uselessly on the icy gravel for a terrifying fraction of a second, but then caught purchase, throwing a shower of rock and dirt behind me. In the rearview mirror, illuminated briefly by the taillights, I saw him standing exactly where my truck had been parked moments earlier. He wasn't chasing anymore. He was simply standing, watching me escape, his hands clasped together like he was praying or perhaps tallying the loss. His face, framed in the mirror, held no anger, no defeat, only the same cold proprietary detachment. He didn't wave, didn't threaten. He just stood witness to my flight, a fixed, permanent detail in the forest landscape. I drove out of that forest like a madman, the speedometer needle climbing far past any reasonable limit, the cab of the truck filled with the ragged sound of my own panic-stricken breathing. I didn't stop until I hit the state highway 30 miles later, pulling over onto the shoulder, collapsing against the steering wheel, dry heaving from the sheer, overwhelming release of tension. The forest was gone. The chilling documentation was hundreds of feet behind me, but the horror was not contained by geography. I looked down at my hands, still shaking uncontrollably. Clutched tightly in my right hand, ripped from the compartment I had opened, was the yellowed slip of paper. The ledger, the list of names, and the final wet line of ink. The witness is observed. I never went to the police. How could I? What evidence did I have that wouldn't immediately brand me as a delusional lunatic, babbling about a serial killer who decorated a Christmas tree with the shoes of his victims, all preserved and categorized? They would ask for the tree, and the tree would likely be gone, the forest reclaimed, the evidence of its existence swallowed by the silence. The watcher would have erased his steps, tidied his documentation. I kept the ledger slip. It's hidden now, deep beneath my floorboards, a silent, terrible testament to what I found. It's the only proof I have that the horror was real, that those tiny shoes, those fragments of lost childhoods, were not just symbols but markers of a continuous, documented evil that thrives in the deepest parts of the quiet woods. The cycle didn't close when I drove away. The documentation merely shifted. He saw me. He logged me. I am now a known variable in his dark equation. I am the one who defiled his altar, the one who possesses a piece of his history. I moved away, far away, selling the property, never looking back at the trees that bordered the forgotten woods. But every Christmas season, when the air turns cold and the first frost settles, I look at my own feet, suddenly hyper-aware of the shoes I wear, the shoes I will leave behind. And I know with absolute terrifying certainty that somewhere in the endless patient silence of that forest, the watcher is waiting, tending to his growing documentation, perhaps even preparing a tiny empty space for my own eventual entry, a pair of worn leather boots measured and filed. The darkness isn't just an absence of light, it's a presence, an enduring tradition meticulously maintained. And if you ever find yourself hiking through ancient, forgotten woods, and you come upon a single startlingly perfect pine tree far off the beaten path, adorned not with tinsel and lights, but with the haunting miniature history of the lost, do not approach it, do not touch the bark, and for the love of everything silent and holy, do not become the next entry in the watcher's meticulous, terrifying ledger. Just turn around, walk quietly away, and pray that he only documents those who fail to leave. Pray that he only counts the silence,